Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Albums Only podcast. My name is Jacob Slater. With me, as always, Alan Beavers. And this week's episode, previous episode, we got to Bob Seger. We got into the heartland, that songs of regret, songs of escape. This time we're doing something a little bit different. We're going a little darker. We're going a little angrier with hardcore punk legends, the Descendants, and their 1982 album, Milo Goes to College, off of New Alliance Records. And the Descendants, at that time, composed of Milo Ackerman, the vocalist Tony Lombardo, Frank Navetta, and Bill Stevenson on drums. Produced by Spot, who was the house producer for SST Records and did a whole bunch of great punk acts. Beeves, what is your kind of experience with punk music?
I'll be honest with you, I don't really have a whole bunch. I mean, when I think of punk music, I think of things like the Sex Pistols. I think of, I don't know if it's because, obviously, I hate to rehash this, but we're from West Virginia, so I don't know if it's the fact that we're more towards the East Coast that we seem to look more at the East Coast New York City punk scene in the late 1970s. But that's sort of what I associate with punk. Sort of the Ramones, Patti Smith, and some other acts that came out of there, like the Talking Heads. I also, again, think of the Sex Pistols as punk. I'm less familiar with the West Coast punk scene. I know of Black Flag. I knew of the Descendants, but I didn't really know them intimately or could say that I knew them well enough to be able to give you a good background on them.
Yeah, I can't remember when I first heard about the Descendants. It was probably in my high school years. As I've probably mentioned before, I was a big fan of the Beastie Boys. Right around when Guitar Hero 3 came out and Sabotage was on the playlist. If you know me, at some point you'll realize that pretty much every one of my favorite bands can be traced back to Guitar Hero in some way. I'm not proud of it. That's just how I am.
You know what, though? That shouldn't be a stigma, for starters, because between Rock Band and Guitar Hero, how many good songs have you heard, how many good bands have you heard that you never would have enjoyed or known had it not been for that avenue? So I don't know. I think the stigma around that needs to die if it's still there.
Yeah, I mean, that was how I discovered Primus. That was how I discovered Rush. So a lot of kind of great bands that I love kind of came from at least the first 3 Guitar Hero games. That was kind of my wheelhouse. But yeah, I was a big fan of the Beastie Boys. And at some point when I was getting into them, I got their kind of compilation anthology CD, The Sounds of Science, which is an amazing compilation. And I found out that before they were a hip-hop group, they were a hardcore punk band. One of the kind of New York hardcore punk bands like Bad Brains and Reagan Youth, that kind of New York all the way down to even Washington, D.C. punk scene. So kind of through that, I discovered different punk bands like the Descendants. I was never a big punk guy. I know there was one of our music directors in U92 was a huge punk fan. And I think it was at that point that I started becoming more appreciative of the form. But it was never something that I was drawn to all that much. I didn't really see I saw the appeal, but I guess it didn't affect me as much as other forms of music did. But you do bring up a good point, Beeves, that nowadays it doesn't really seem to be all that prevalent, with the creation of the internet. People are able to listen to music from pretty much everywhere in the world, whenever they want to. But at the time, there was a very kind of distinct, a very distinct kind of separation between the same genre of music, but in different regions. So we're more of an East Coast person, maybe a little even the Washington, D.C. scene. But our music was kind of brought about by the Velvet Underground and bands like that, very kind of arty, intelligent bands. And a lot of the punk music and alternative music that came from New York is very arty, you could say. Very art rock inspired, very kind of progressive in a lot of ways. And even into post-punk and new wave and no wave, there's a very distinct kind of attitude towards what they're doing. And so we're familiar with that. The West Coast is something that I think both of us are completely almost alien towards. I mean, you have to understand that the West Coast, and specifically Los Angeles, is a very musical town.
I have to say, Jacob, one of the things I find more interesting is when I familiarize myself, and historically when I familiarized myself with sort of the West Coast punk scene, in my mind, for whatever reason, that's actually more punk to me. I don't know if it's because it's harder. It sounds more nihilistic, maybe. It's more overtly political in a lot of ways. I don't know. When I hear Black Flag, when I hear the Descendants, when I hear, X in Los Angeles, I think it's just harder to me. It sounds like punk. And I don't know why in my brain I've made that sort of connection. But I think it's because a lot of the bands that I enjoy that came from the punk scene on the 70s, from the late 70s, from the East Coast, the Televisions and the Talking Heads and the other bands of that ilk, they're more poppier. They got into more arty kind of, endeavors, as we talked about. So I actually feel like the West Coast punk scene is what I associate with punk. It seems more true to the punk aesthetic. I could be wrong.
As we'll kind of get into, and as you can kind of see for yourself, there was a definite kind of shift in popular music and alternative music in the late 70s in LA towards a harsher, perhaps more true to what we consider the punk aesthetic. But I think we tend to think in popular culture that punk music was a shot in the dark, I guess, a very kind of thing that came out of the blue as a kind of rejection and reaction towards the music that was popular at the time, your prog rock, your disco and everything like that. But really, when you take a look at it, there wasn't really that much of a real shift in the music that was going on at the time. In the the mid-70s, you had the glam rock bands, Joe Briath and Sparks, which we had an episode about a while back. David Bowie, who was very popular. Very simple kind of music, very kind of stompy rock and roll music, but dressed up, in very kind of fashion-minded and building up an illusion and everything like that. So kind of the artists that grew up with those bands obviously took that inspiration and kind of worked on that. And in some ways they took that simple idea of rock and roll music from, the glam rock bands, even all the way back to the garage rock bands and the surf rock bands of the 1960s, and they took the simplicity and the energy of those bands that were so popular at that time, and they did what musicians do, which is to take inspiration and retool it in some way. So to say that punk music was a instantaneous thing that just appeared out of nowhere, I don't think is necessarily accurate. I think there's a clear line of inspiration from all the way back to the Stooges in 1969 up to bands like the Germs, who were one of the kind of hardcore founders, and the Descendants, this hardcore thing. So let's talk a little bit about the band and the album here. Milo Goes to College. Yeah, an album that, from its title, implies a big change, and was in fact a big change for the band. After this album was released, Milo Ackerman would actually go to college for biology, I believe, in the University of San Diego. So it's also the last album to feature Frank Nevada, I believe, the guitarist on the album. He would leave following the band's hiatus after this record. So yeah, this was an album that really signified a change for the band. You know, from its title, from the music, which really acts as a sort of bridge, I think, between like hardcore purist stuff, like Germs and Black Flag, and much more pop-minded, melodically minded music that you would see in the later 80s with bands like The Replacements and Husker Du. Before we get into the album proper, I wanted to ask you, B, since this has been on my mind since I've been listening to this album, what was your entry into college like? Because this is an album that's signifies a big change. What was like college like for you as you entered it? What was your big change?
You know, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I had a big change. I grew up in the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia and went to a small college that was, and I mean the word literally, not as some sort of like, I was literally 10 feet away. I literally lived probably 500 feet away from the first college that I attended. And I lived at that house for 12 years prior to walking the 500 feet to class every day when I was 18 years old to go to my first class. So for me, college was a slow transition. It wasn't until 2 years after I started college that I moved off to WVU, where you and I both graduated from, and had sort of a unique college experience there, which was pretty party heavy, which was sort of a freedom. It was scary at first for me. I've sort of found it a bit frightening, to be honest with you. But it was liberating and it was exciting. And you can kind of see that here in the band, too. You can kind of see it channeled through the music. There's actually a lot to talk about as far as the lyrics of this album go. I was surprised in a way at how diverse this album is, how well put together it is. The other thing, too, that surprises me about the Descendants that I just wanted to bring up here is the simple fact that this is a band who's gone in and out of hiatuses, which is fascinating to me. You rarely see this, where, especially among particularly popular bands in whatever genre it may be, you rarely see where the band sort of will jump in and out of being a band. And the Descendants did this. I mean, they were together early in the late 70s and early 80s, broke up, so to speak, had a hiatus so that Milo could go to college. In 1985, they got back together again and recorded. They proceeded to come apart again and then get back together as it suits them, as they wanted to. They, each wanted to do their independent projects, and they keep coming back to the Descendants to release new material. So I find that fascinating. That's something you generally don't see too much, and it's respectable that the group, the core members here, have something that they can come back to, have a certain sound, and they're also not afraid to get out there and to do other things. So in that aspect, I find the Descendants really unique and very encouraging, the band aesthetic and what the band thinks of one another. They're not afraid to be apart, but they keep coming back and enjoy being in each other's company and releasing new albums. So that's a great thing to put forward there. Your thoughts, Jacob? I mean, your college experience, can you relate to punk music through the college lens, or what was that like for you?
My first year in college was actually pretty rough, actually. Seems a bit strange to say, but it was to the point that I was seriously considering dropping out at a certain point. I mean, where we've already talked about kind of my issues with depression and my developmental problems and everything else. But to a greater extent, I was someone who grew up and attained my education and everything like that in one area. I kind of went to elementary school, middle school, high school with a lot of the same people. So the people I knew when I was a 5-year-old, I knew when I was 18. So when I moved to WVU, which was hours away from my home, and a place where none of the people that I had become friends with went to. It was a very, very strange experience, a very almost traumatic experience to suddenly be alone and to be on your own and kind of expected to deal with your own shit when for so long I had kind of had a routine and I had familiarity. So yeah, that first year was really rough. I struggled, to make friends and try to keep a schedule going, and yeah, and it's kind of disheartening because the main reason I had went to WVU in the first place because I had heard of U92, and that the idea of becoming a DJ and to kind of immerse myself in music was a main reason why I wanted to visit WVU and to go here. In the first year of college, when I applied to U92, I was rejected. So
really, I did not know this. Interesting.
Yeah, the first year was a lot of the people that we kind of know and became friends with in U92 were not at the station at the time. It was a lot of kind of new faces, or old faces, I guess. But yeah, I didn't make the cut for probably several reasons. I didn't have a car and everything. So the fact that I was living in towers was a kind of a big issue. But I had decided to make this big change and kind of leave what was familiar to me and everything for this one goal, which was then at that time denied to me. So yeah, it was really rough, and I had gone so far as to kind of talk to the administrators and everything to see about getting, just drop out, and kind of because I didn't think I could handle just being on my own and being by myself. But in the end, I think it was something that I needed because, and this is like my bit of advice to people. Everything else I did in college was pretty much worthless, but I think this bit of advice is good for you, is that, stick with it, I think. If you're someone has lived their life in familiarity and then is going somewhere new, kind of exploring stuff like I did, stick with it, because I think is a character building moment. Because after a year of this loneliness and this depression that I was into, I did actually feel like I had grown as a person, that I became more self-sufficient and everything. So although it was bad that first year, I think ultimately it helped me it was that kind of transitional moment from child to adult.
That's a great point. I think for people to just know that powering through something, when you face adversity, you can overcome it, and if you do, you'll be stronger for it. Sort of that anti-fragile kind of mindset where what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Now that's not true for a lot of things. It's true for things like bone and bone density and other such sort of things. But yeah, I think that's an important point to just in general to remember, is that I think continue to stick through and to fight through something. And if you fail, you fail, but you learn from it and you move on. And you didn't fail. You eventually did get to U92 and had a great run there, and we had a lot of fun working together. Does that tie in here? Any thoughts here tie into the Descendants or the punk scene?
Just that after college and kind of after that big transitional period, I can view this albums like it with a newer lens. Because at the time, I probably didn't think about it, but looking at it now, a lot of what you see on this record, the kind of themes and the desires of the band, really kind of speak to how people I knew and how I felt a lot of the time when I was a teenager, and kind of how I felt in that late adolescent period before I kind of moved off and kind of into newer pastures, kind of the frustration of being caught in the system and everything, and that girls and everything else like that.
Yeah, well, that's something that we had actually talked about previously, was that this album, it's harder for us to relate to. I mean, we can look back on it with a little clarity. I mean, I'm 31. You're 26, 25, 26? You're 26? It's funny, with time, we kind of look back, and like, if I was 19, 20 again, I would love this album. I think it would hit more notes. But yeah, that's totally understandable. You can kind of take a step back at the age that we're at, which is, I get it, far from old. But the point is, we can see in retrospect sort of the place that the Descendants were at, were many of the band members of the Descendants, but not all. And that's something that I actually wanted to cover here, is the bassist of the band.
Tony Lombardo.
So Tony Lombardo is significantly older than the rest of the bandmates here on this album. And what really comes through to me is that the songs that he's written are actually quite sincere. They're delivered in sometimes in a snarky, kind of mocking, satirical tone. But I find his bass to be the real centerpiece here. The lyrics are great. They're largely intelligible, but yet, they have that anger in them. The guitar works really well. The drums get the point home. I find the bass to be the centerpiece, the driver of the album. And I think it's Tony Lombardo who's the real hero of this album, at least to me. And I don't know if you wanted to comment on that or if we were ready to go ahead and go into the first track.
There's a definite bass prominence in this record, and I think a bass prominence that you see in a lot of hardcore punk bands around this area. They got a great sense of using the bass as a kind of rhythmic centerpiece, and that didn't ever really quit until even the 90s. I mean, the stuff that you hear here with the hardcore punk scene, with its bass-heavy kind of stuff, would, eventually transform into the funk metal of Primus and Red Hot Chili Peppers and everything. So, I mean, I love the bass guitar, honestly. So any band that respects the bass as an instrument and kind of a foundation of great music is always great to me.
Well, a bass line, I mean, if you want me to like your music and you have a killer bass line, you've won, as far as I'm concerned. One thing I want to point out...
Just bass and just saxophone, I think. There's a band that's just bass guitar and saxophone, we will give you 2 thumbs up.
Right. That's all that I need, personally. So one of the other things I want to point out, and we'll jump right into the album, is... there is another aesthetic to the Descendants that's very important, I think, and that's the cover of their albums. They all include this figure of Milo, the lead singer, that is drawn by Jeff "Rat" Atkinson. And that style would continue through most of the remaining albums that they've put out up until the most recent, in fact. And it's very unique, and it's actually friendly and very identifiable. And it's one of the things that makes the Descendants so very important to punk music.
Yeah, it's very kind of iconic.
It is. So we go into, let's go ahead and start with the album and start with My Age, the first track on the album. This track opens with that wonderful bass introduction, and then it almost has, for a split second there, you get almost like a surfer rock kind of guitar going on, almost a tribute to the West Coast in a way. I don't know how else to really describe it, but it has sort of that old surfer rock at a sped up rate going for it. The song itself is probably one of the bigger ones on the album.
Yeah, definitely a kind of surf rock thing, and I believe, obviously this is a coastal city that the Descendants are from, so surf rock has always been kind of a staple of the LA music scene all the way back until the early 60s with Dick Dale. Yeah, very surf rocky. I remember reading a little bit about the history of the band, and they mentioned that when they would write songs, they would drink a lot of coffee while they were doing it.
Yes, they're huge into caffeine. They love the caffeine.
And so surf rock plus way too much caffeine, I guess, is the formula to make a Descendants song. But very good stuff. You know, you get exactly what you need out of the Descendants with this song. Very punk stuff. Milo Ackerman's shouting vocals, which I think was relatively unique. I think this was like the moment where you started seeing a greater prevalence of kind of non-traditional vocal performances. It's not just like singing anymore. It's, you know, just shouting, like a even more emotional way of getting a message across, I guess. Really like the chorus on this song. Just it's really fun, I think. And the song itself, yeah, it really kind of starts you off on the kind of teenager train, I think, in a lot of ways. It's just like a guy lamenting about a woman who he thinks is kind of playing him for a fool, I guess.
We move on from there to I Want to Be a Bear. This one, it's under, like, it's 40 seconds. It's just a quick blast of energy. For me, there's not too much to note on that one, but I do want to note on the next track, I'm Not a Loser. This is really interesting because this is where you start to notice you just start to notice the difference in the songwriters, because you have pretty much everyone in their own way attributing something to these songs. And here on I'm Not a Loser, this is Nevada, the
guitarist.
Yeah, the founding guitarist, Frank Nevada. And so what you hear here is, I mean, this is pretty aggressive, kind of offensive stuff that, you know, he's just very angry, and his girlfriend, the woman that he's taking out, you know, doesn't want to be with him, and he bought crappy drugs, and it's just sort of like this like rebellious teenager lamenting how everything that he is doing rebellious isn't working out, and just being very upset about it, and just, you know, being as mean and hateful as possible in a way. But it's interesting because we're going to see how that contrasts with some of the other writers, and I just want to point that out because you get that, and then you get Lombardo's work, which is sung as satirical, but really isn't. It was actually meant to be sincere. So we'll go into that in a bit, but I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I Want to Be a Bear, less than even 50 seconds long. So the Descendants, in true kind of hardcore fashion, taking a cue from the Ramones with brevity is the soul of wit in a lot of ways, and taking that even further to songs that aren't even a minute long. You know, just blasting through a message and kind of still really kind of creating a fully realized song, even in such a short amount of time. Kind of a really dumb song. It's kind of like a 14-year-old's version of the Beach Boys, A Day in the Life of a Tree. It's like, I just want to be a bear, shit in the woods. It's kind of really dumb, silly song. Yeah, I'm Not a Loser, the first I'm Not a song on this record.
There will be more, indeed.
Yeah, just like My Age was the first age song of this record. Despite the kind of dated lyrics here, you know, you don't really have anybody throwing around as much homophobic language, I think, nowadays than these guys do here. Sounds a little dated in the kind of type of language used.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for what's going on. It just seems like just angry epithets thrown for effect. I don't know that it's literal. I think it's just saying something offensive to be offensive.
Like, I don't know how prevalent it is nowadays, but, you know, even back when I was a kid, you know, people would throw around, like, oh, you're gay, you're a homo, and everything like that as an insult. So, you know, just kind of a relic of the past, but otherwise it's kind of, yeah, it's a youthful rebellion song, I guess, kind of saying that call me a loser, but I work hard. And you people are kind of you yuppies are kind of the wastrels. And
Yes, we're working 60 a week.
yeah, pretty good song. The next song on this record is one of my favorites, Parents.
Featuring a nut. This is, again, Frank Navetta, the guitarist. I'm not a loser, and Parents are right next to each other, and you can very much tell they're written by the same person. And this is a good track, though. This does have that kind of energy to it, and is very of its day punk.
A darker song, almost has like a, not even sure how to describe the beat, almost like a rumba or something like that. Kind of very dance-like. A song that is probably like the most teenager song on the record. Just like about parents and why won't they shut up. Just complaining about the typical teenager complaint of parents they just don't understand. You know, Will Smith said it best. Parents just don't understand. A darker song almost because it deals with kind of a teenager's alienation from their parents, and then it kind of goes into I will kill and I'll destroy. Kind of that like a hidden darkness, I guess. I don't know. I don't think that's too uncommon, really. I think like as a kind of disaffected kid feels neglected in that way. That thoughts kind of turn to morbid topics like that, and occasionally it's unfortunate that it kind of translates to the real world. But it's teenagerdom in a nutshell, I think. I really actually like this song a lot. We move on to the fifth song on the album, Tony Age, the second of the Age songs on here. Another one with a kind of interesting instrumentation going on here. Kind of reminds me of that one song that you'd always hear in like Looney Tunes cartoons or something like that whenever they need to show automation going on.
Oh, what is that? Yes, I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah, I don't know the name of the song, but it's like that da 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 da. I don't know if that was the intent with this song, but it definitely reminds me of that song. Features, I think, a little bit of harmony going on. I think there's like, it's kind of the first song where it's not just Milo. There's kind of multiple voices on here. And it's a song that kind of places itself within the scene going on at the time. It's very kind of a prescient song because it mentions, you know, in like the first kind of few lines, you know, you beat up Fear's bass player. We were all surfers last year. 3 years ago, it wasn't cool. You spit on me, but I'm no one. Bobby Penn had long hair, but you spit on Darby Crash. Darby Crash, obviously the lead singer and founder of the Germs, which were at the time a legendary, and still are legendary, band in the LA scene in the late 70s, kind of the first of the hardcore punk bands in a lot of ways. And Fear was another one of those kind of defining punk bands. Fear, actually, just a little bit of a trivia note, had a big fan in John Belushi, and it was actually John Belushi's kind of word of approval that got Fear to perform at Saturday Night Live long, long ago. So it's a song that kind of derides, I guess you would say, like posers of the time, people who are trying to like seem punk but aren't punk, trying to get in on the scene without having the kind of street cred. But yeah, whatever that Rube Goldberg song is, I'm wondering.
I can't find it right away. I know what you're talking about. There's another song called Powerhouse that's very similar to that was used in some Looney Tune cartoons, but I'm almost positive that's not the one you're thinking of. So
really little fun song. We move on to the sixth track on the album, M16, and as you might expect, it's a very militarily focused song. Kind of has that kind of military march sound to it. Song that doesn't pull any punches with their attitudes about the military and army life, I guess. Taking a little look at the lyrics here. Army life is right for me, kill to save democracy. Got a rebel in my sights, money's worth more than his life, so kill, it's fun. So, not fans, I guess, of the military. Obviously, this was the early 80s. The memories of Vietnam were probably still fresh at this point. So the general opinion of the military was probably universally not all that high. So, it's not too surprising, I suppose. Little fun song. 43 seconds long, according to Spotify, which makes it 1 second longer than I Want to Be a Bear. So if you're making a contest out of it, then I Want to Be a Bear, currently the shortest song. Moving on to track number 7, I'm Not a Punk, to contrast with I'm Not a Loser earlier on the album. Song that musically reminds me a little bit of Parents, I think. For me, it has a kind of similar feel in the tones of the guitar.
I actually like this one. I have to tell you, the previous two, I just didn't feel like spending much time on. Tony Age and M16. They're fine. They're quick. You pointed out good things about them regarding what they're each about. I'm Not a Punk is a good song. I like it quite a bit. I like the lyrics that start off. It's very to the point. It's very kind of contrarian for the scene that they're in. The lyrics are, I'm not a punk. How can I be? Show me the way to conformity. Try to be different, but it's always the same. End up playing someone else's game. I'm just a square going nowhere. And I find that fascinating. I mean, I like the idea that they can't, even punk, which is supposed to be nonconformist, is conformity in its own way. And again, this is a Lombardo song. So I think with you see that sort of good writing, just the sort of even rejection of punk. I kind of like that. I was intrigued by that, and I didn't expect it.
That's like the great kind of irony, isn't it, that this kind of nonconformist alternative music would then get saddled with a label like punk, and suddenly there's punk bands and punk fashion and punk culture. And what was once an expression of kind of your own individuality is suddenly just another name on a form somewhere. So yeah, I can definitely see like where the issue is that you don't want to, like, to be a punk, you don't want to be called a punk, because with that name comes a whole bunch of expectations and guidelines that you're supposed to follow. So it's a very kind of honest song in that way, that you don't. I don't want to be a punk because I don't want to be playing other people's games. I want to be my own real person. I think there's some I think they got a great chorus here. I think I really like how Milo Ackerman does the chorus, kind of almost like a bell curve. It goes like all the way up and then kind of fades down as well. I think there's like some great drumming in this song as well. I really like really heavy stuff going on. Moving on to track number 8, Catalina, a song that might sound familiar to people who are familiar with hardcore punk of the time, because it opens with a spoken word kind of thing, similar to what Henry Rollins would do when he was with Black Flag. I think you see it a lot in Damage. Same with Institutionalized by Suicidal Tendencies. Like a very kind of different way to do music, I think, which I don't really. It seems like something that was of the LA scene, because I can't think of many punk bands on the West Coast kind of doing this almost arty spoken word kind of stuff. Yeah, a song that is about kind of just a person who is trying to escape it all, I guess. He doesn't want to deal with other people, so he's kind of out on his boat. I'll steal some gas, fix my motor, turn on my doors tape, get you out of my head. So yeah, just like a song about getting away and like chilling. Don't want to deal with stuff, which I can appreciate. And even without the dialogue, I think it's a kind of really dancey song. Kind of a real fun song if you that is combined with kind of a non-musical way of performing and singing.
Want to go ahead and move on to Suburban Home. A really great track. I love this one a lot too. It's another Lombardo track, so obviously I have a thing for the bassist here. But I love this song because it's sung in a cynical tone. It's sung as sort of a satirical, I want to be stereotyped. I want to be classified is the little verbal nod at the beginning. But actually, my understanding is Lombardo wrote this as an actual confession that he wants a suburban home. And it's sort of been taken and flipped on its head, and it's sort of satirical about this sort of desire just to be another, middle-class clone, so to speak. So I find it to be a very, it has a nice chorus there with Suburban Home. I like the way it's sung. I like the song, and I think the message is kind of neat just in the background and sort of the satirical nature of the song.
It's definitely one of these songs that you really start to see a melodic focus on, especially with the chorus there. Not sure how to kind of just what the musical term is for how it's done, but like the repetition of Suburban Home, it's probably one of my favorite parts of the song. Just kind of this beautiful in its way, Suburban Home, and then ba-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. Really like it. Very good song. Very kind of ironic, I guess, that just a few songs ago we were talking about I'm not a punk. I don't want to be stuck in a label. And then later on it's, well, I want to be stereotyped. I want to be classified. Just a kind of a yearning for the tranquility, I guess, that suburban life had kind of, the mythology of suburban life had kind of, it was popular back then. Track number 10, Statue of Liberty. Fun little song. Kind of the anti-establishment, I guess, the kind of anti-social message of screw the Statue of Liberty, basically, I think is what they're going for there. But pretty fun. Number 11, Kabuki Girl, which I think was a song that I was familiar with before listening to this album. Kind of a basic kind of mosh / skate punk kind of song. It's a song you would want to bounce around and jump to. Really basic, not really much to go with, except it has a pretty great chorus. Marriage is an interesting track. It's another one of the songs that is actually one of my favorite tracks on this album, actually. Just like the way it opens, it almost seems like, doesn't sound like anything you'd expect.
It does. It breathes a little too. I mean, it's a very short track. I think it's just over a minute. But, it's a minute and a half. Okay, so a little bit of one of the longer ones. I agree with you, though. There's something here where it's not as overwhelming. The guitar and the bass don't overwhelm as much. I like this song quite a lot. I think it's really good. Again, it's sort of this confessional. I can't tell what's satirical and what's real. I like the lines with, I don't want to have sex with you. I want to be your friend. I want to be with you. Which is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's with teenagers, you always expect songs to be revolving around sex, I guess. So it's always interesting to kind of see a song where it's not, where it's about actual kind of love and romance rather than just like the physical side of things. But it's also, I think, a song that really is reminiscent of youth, I think. Kind of this idealized, romanticized version of marriage, which wouldn't be like out of place in a Beach Boys album. You could see Brian Wilson sing a song about marriage.
You could. I find this interesting too because this one is written by Frank Navetta, who does some of the harder stuff on the album. So I'm sure it probably is with a bit of a wink and a nod, but I still really enjoy it. I like the way it sounds too. It's just a great track.
I love that chorus, I think, is probably one of the best choruses on the album.
Well, you know what I think about you. There's something about that sticks in your head. It's really good.
Yeah, so we move on to track number 13, Hope. It's another one of those songs that reminds me of kind of being a teenager, like parents. Not in a good way, though. It's almost like a friend zone song in a lot of ways. It's a song where you can just kind of, like, I think everyone's kind of known someone or has seen someone, like, on the internet or something, kind of espouse the same kind of sentiments as you see with this song.
It's the only song, too, written by Ackerman himself, the only one he's credited for on the solo. So interesting point there. Maybe it spoke to him, or maybe he could relate.
It's not necessarily something that I couldn't relate with. We kind of, as youths, I guess, kind of take things so seriously in regards to romance in that way. But I mean, just like the lines like, the way you want to feel when he starts to lie, when he makes you cry, you know I'll be there. My day will come, I know. Sometimes I'll be the only one. Which, sounds at first romantic, but then, like, by the end of the song, it's like, you'll take your bruised little head and you'll come running back to me. You know that I'm going to be the only one. So it's like he's not really...
It sounds like some denial is still in there.
Yeah, it's not about the girl or her happiness. It's about, well, once you get fucked up, I'm going to be here, and you're going to have no choice, basically, to come back to me. Like, it's very kind of immature in that way. And it's something that I still see a lot in my day-to-day life, and it always kind of makes me cringe in that way, because we've all lived it. I think we've all kind of know people who've been like that. But track number 14, Bike Age, the last Age song on the record. Another one of my favorites, actually. Not really a hardcore punk song at all. This is like one of those tracks that is very firmly kind of in the, not sure how you would even describe it, like the American underground Husker Du style punk music, where even hardcore punk, which is like this purist kind of thing, eventually kind of incorporated pop stylings and melodic overtones and everything. So this is like one of the kind of the more heavier melodic songs on here.
Yeah, interesting point. I agree with you. I like the song. I like the bass at the end. It really comes clear as the song, like, last 20 seconds. You really get it. That bass line really hits, and it's really good. This song is the first of only two that are written by the drummer, Bill Stevenson. The last one, Gene is Dead, also written by Stevenson. And so, yeah, it's really his only two solo credits, and they end the album. So it almost feels like they're a bit of an afterthought. But Bike Age is really good. I like that one quite a bit.
I mentioned the Replacements, and I think the Replacements is probably the kind of closest musical comparison when we're talking about Bike Age, not just in kind of the music, but also kind of the lyrical content as well. I mean, Bike Age is a song about not necessarily like teenage prostitutes, but kind of teenagers who are kind of the hard life of a teenager, I guess, with drug use and kind of underage sex and all this kind of other stuff. But painted in a very kind of depressing, kind of dark manner, which doesn't seem all that different from what you'd hear Paul Westerberg sing about in the prime Replacements albums. Really enjoy it. Great bass line as well, I think. Then finally, we get to Gene is Dead, which might be a reference to Paul is Dead, that famous Beatles urban legend, where you could supposedly hear the band say that Paul is dead, and oh no, maybe Paul McCartney has actually been dead all this time, and he's been replaced by a pod person or whatever the hell it was. Kind of a return back to form in a lot of ways. It's very kind of more of a standard punk song, reminiscent of the Ramones. And unlike a lot of the songs, it's not about kind of self-hatred or antisocial behavior or anything else like that. It's just like a guy who's alone, whose girls left him, and now he's just sad. Now you're gone and I'm alone, the chorus says. And it doesn't get any simpler than that, I guess. But, really fun song. Nice way to close off the album. Anything to say about this record, Beeves, as a whole?
As a whole, not too much. I appreciate short records. I mean, I think we might have mentioned this previously, but this album is 22 minutes and 10 seconds, which is shorter than almost anything that I have in my collection. But I actually found it really rewarding because you're getting 15 songs, and even though they're short, it's punk. Everything is there. Your bass lines are there. They're just abbreviated. One thing I like about punk and the punk scene is you can't say that they waste your time. That would be one thing that I really love. I feel like even though this is 22 minutes long, you get your money's worth. It's an enjoyable album. There are songs on here, obviously I'm not a huge punk fan, but there are some songs on here that I love that I think are really great. There's some songs on here that kind of run together for me, and they're enjoyable. If you like punk, they've been covered. I'm looking here. I mean, they've been covered by Taking Back Sunday and the Voodoo Glow Skulls and Mike Watt and a bunch. So these songs are iconic in the punk scene. Some of them don't do it for me. A lot of them I really like. So it was a good experience for me. I learned a lot from this album, and I'm glad that it's one that we did.
Even if you don't like every song on the record, and it's understandable, not everyone has to like everything, but like even if you listen to the whole record, you're not investing a lot of time. This is shorter than your average TV episode. So if your question is about time, you don't really have to invest all that much into it. As a record, I really enjoyed it. Ever since the days of the Beastie Boys, I've kind of grown more and more favorable towards punk and kind of got more in the punk attitude and mindset in a lot of ways. I think that even if me and Beeves are old fogies in terms of this record's demographic, if you're a younger viewer, I think you'll still feel a lot of the things that you do on this record. And this might be something that you want to play if you're heading off to college. Kind of an album that you want to listen to, that you might want to identify with before you make the big transition into adulthood, like Milo Ackerman did, like I did, and like Beeves did. It's an album that deals with a lot of anxieties and kind of attitudes that we all face at some point in our lives, but done in a very sometimes angry, sometimes melodic, but otherwise all enjoyable kind of way. But that does it for this week's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Next week we are covering, I don't even know how to say it, probably one of the most important, most popular alternative rock albums just ever. It's from my year of birth, 1991. And no, I'm not talking about Pearl Jam's 10. I'm talking about Loveless by Kevin Shields and the My Bloody Valentines.
Basically. I must tell you, so 1991 is a very special year for me, I have to say, in terms of music. I was only 6, so nothing special happened when I was in 1991, personally. But My Bloody Valentine is arguably my favorite record of all time. My second favorite record of all time, also from 1991, Talk Talk's Laughing Stock. My point at the end of the day, though, is that 91 is a great year for music. You want to really just dive into a year and talk about years in music, 91, it kicks some ass. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun talking about My Bloody Valentine and everything that goes along with it. So, Jacob, anything you want to add before we get out of here?
Just that, hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope you enjoyed next week's episode, because Loveless is one thing, but really this is celebrating the year that the great music podcaster Jacob Slater was born.
Really? So, at the end of the day, yeah, that's what it's like.
It's like Fall of the Berlin Wall. No. Like, this is what's really important. So, see you guys later.
I want to thank everyone again for listening. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at albumsonly. You can email us at albumsonlypodcast@gmail.com. We'll be back next week with the inimitable Loveless. Goodbye, everyone.